to deal with people that have these seemingly unremitting disorders. So I want to start with a little background. We haven't talked that much about autoimmune disease or autoinflammatory disease over the weekend, but I want you to have a little context, which is that the initial term to describe this was horror autotoxicus. Isn't that a great term? Horror autotoxicus, which is the notion that the immune system, for some reason, is reacting against self. Now, this whole notion came about the same time that Metchnikoff was discovering phagocytosis in the starfish larvae. So, get the idea that not much was really known about immunology at the time. The father of immunology was a German bacteriologist named Paul Ehrlich, who actually won the Nobel Prize in Medicine in 1908. And he believed profoundly and assertively that autoimmunity couldn't exist. That if somebody did develop autoimmunity, it would be life-threatening. That's why he called it horror autotoxicus. He believed that if our lymphocytes were to develop reactivity against tissues, then we had some kind of mechanism built in that would get rid of them. Turns out he was partially right. We do have mechanisms to get rid of self-reactive lymphocytes. We do have mechanisms to help silence them so that if they start to cause trouble, then they can be kept under control. But Dr. Ehrlich had a very strong personality, and he convinced everybody that he knew what he was talking about. So no one questioned him, even though there was evidence of autoimmune disease. People knew about lupus autoantibodies for years. Researchers knew about autoimmune hemolytic anemia for years. So there was evidence that autoimmunity could exist, but Dr. Ehrlich said it didn't. So we got kind of stuck in that really for 30 some years. No one would admit it. Finally, it was irrefutable that autoimmunity was a cause of many diseases. And now we know that autoimmunity causes a whole range of diseases and is extremely common. It's not even a rare disorder. It's happening all the time. So the whole idea of autoimmunity was that the immune system made some fundamental mistake. It got confused in its ability to discriminate self versus non-self. In the simplest possible terms, the synovium lining a joint looks like foreign tissue, looks like a bacteria, or looks like a food. So the immune system makes that mistake and goes after it. There's sequence homology in the molecular structure of something in the body that looks like a foreigner. So that was called the self versus stranger, the stranger concept. That's what it was thought that autoimmunity was about, a simple error. It turns out, however, that there's a lot of problems with that concept. What about cancer? If the immune system is that great at recognizing non-self, why doesn't the immune system recognize cancer? What's going on there? The other thing is a lot of people have lymphocytes that are autoreactive. So lymphocytes that are not being silenced, that could potentially attack body tissues, that could attack synovium. And I haven't mentioned it here, but we also have a lot of antibodies that could potentially attack our tissue. We have millions of antibodies in our bloodstream. And if you do a standard antibody profile on people, if you check for everything, you'll almost always find antibodies against some kind of self tissue. So why doesn't the immune system develop a more severe reaction when those autoreactive lymphocytes or antibodies are there? On the other hand, you've got a lot of autoimmune diseases where there are no autoantibodies, where you haven't identified any particular antigen. So there are holes in this whole notion of self versus non-self being the core phenomenon. In comes Polly Matzinger, very interesting woman. She started out as a Playboy bunny. I'm not making this up. The way the story goes is that she was waiting on a table in a restaurant. A couple of immunologists were having a chat about the immune system. She overheard them, asked some really probing questions, and they looked at her and said, wow, you really have a good mind and you should pursue this. So she did. She went ahead and got a PhD in immunology and ended up with her own lab at NIH. And she's really credited with promoting this whole idea that the immune system is less concerned with the self versus non-self concept than it is with mounting responses to danger signals, what she called entities that do damage. And where is that recognition going on? It's all happening in the immune synapse, which I showed you pictures of before. Antigen presenting cells, dendritic cells, macrophages, etc. And where are these alarm signals coming into play? It's with the co-stimulatory molecules, which, as I mentioned, in my lecture on immunomodulators, I talked about how we can induce autoimmune disease by overactivating these co-stimulatory molecules, right? With the checkpoint inhibitors, we're inhibiting the checkpoint. We allow co-stimulatory molecules to turn on T lymphocytes, which then turn on B cells, and that's what leads to chronic inflammation. So this is the stranger plus danger model of inflammation. And this is a picture from the New England Journal of Medicine showing how those mechanisms might be working. You have a combination on the left of microbes and their products. By themselves, they may just be pathogen-associated molecular patterns. But when you start adding in apoptotic fragments, cells that are ground up, or cellular debris, which includes mitochondria, DNA, etc., when you mix all of those together, they interact with pathogen-related receptors, toll-like receptors and NLR receptors. And this turns on multiple intracellular mechanisms, which can then lead to either autoimmune disease or autoinflammatory disease. Now, what's the difference in the two? I will come back and explain that later. So is it all about genes? Is this happening because people have bad genes, single nucleotide polymorphisms? No. There are a number of genetic variants that do predispose a huge percentage of the population to autoimmunity or even autoinflammatory disorders, but just a small fraction get autoimmune disorders. So genes are not destiny. There's got to be triggers and mediators involved. Mild forms of autoimmune disease are probably occurring in most people. Sometimes a person will get a viral infection and then they'll get a rash or joint aches after that. There's some pretty good evidence that getting COVID can stimulate autoimmunity. Can that be long-term autoimmunity? We don't really know yet. The disease hasn't been around long enough, but it's certainly possible. But more likely that people are getting transient autoimmunity. That's what I want you to understand. That transient autoimmunity is probably happening all the time. And what triggers a full-fledged response? It's ongoing exposure to air pollution, toxic chemicals in the environment, mercury, for example. Certain medications, statins, have been shown to trigger autoimmunity. Bacterial infections that have been around for at least a week to 10 days, post-streptococcal glomerulonephritis. So the person may have a predisposition, but it takes something in the environment, an infection, a toxin, etc., that the person is exposed to over an extended period of time to trigger a full-fledged response. Now, why is this important? Because we know that 10 million people or more will test positive for anti-nuclear antibody many years before they have any symptoms at all. We can say, and this is what you read in the literature, well, it doesn't mean anything. They've got a 1 to 160 ANA, and They're not having any symptoms, so they're probably fine. To me, this indicates loss of tolerance and that they are in a germination period. This indicates that they are susceptible to exposure to toxins, trauma, microbes, etc. So they're in a fragile, susceptible state. The earlier you can pick up any evidence of loss of tolerance, the more likely the person is to benefit from functional medicine interventions. And this is really the area where functional medicine shines. One other factor that you've got to consider here is that most autoimmune diseases happen in women. So, what is it about that gender, about the female gender, that makes women more susceptible to autoimmune disease? You see on the far left, Sjogren's disease, almost all women. Lupus, mostly women. Thyroid disorders, mostly women. Autoimmune hepatitis, mostly women. Same thing is true for scleroderma, myasthenia gravis, rheumatoid arthritis. Double the number of women get it than men. Two big theories. One is because women have two of those X chromosomes, they have double the immunity. Women tend to have stronger immune systems, but that stronger immunity may make them more prone to having an autoreactive phenomenon going on. The other thing is that it's something about hormones, either a lack of androgens or certain estrogen metabolites. And we do talk about this in some detail in the biotransformation environmental toxicology module. So with all that in mind, let's talk about a patient of mine, a 39-year-old woman who presents with chronic constipation and a persistently dry mouth. She shows up in my office chewing gum incessantly, chewing gum. What was her history? Well, she was fine until 5 years prior when she had a daughter, baby, born a few weeks early, not severely premature, but a few weeks early. Fortunately, the baby was healthy. Everything seemed to go fine until about 2 weeks postpartum. She develops this persistent, severe dry mouth. And that's when she started chewing the gum. She goes to see a rheumatologist who does blood tests on her, a Sjogren's antibody panel. He says, it's negative, but you probably still have it. You've got dry mouth, you've got risk factors, so you probably have it. Well, her symptoms gradually faded away. She forgot about it, didn't think about it. Then she has a second baby. And 6 months after the second baby, her eyes start feeling super dry, like there's sand in them. She has morning stiffness in her joints, but the joints are not hot, red, or swollen, but they ache all over. So dry eyes, joint aches, and another thing that may not seem related, but could be directly related, is that her libido goes way down for a young woman. Little bit about her history. She was adopted. She was conceived and she grew up near Lake Erie. Some of you might remember that Lake Erie once caught on fire. Maybe more than once caught on fire. It was thought to be very, very toxic. So this was in Northwest Pennsylvania, where she lived, and she didn't know a lot of details about her early childhood, but she did look it up later and said, yeah, this is one of the most toxic areas in the country. So it looked like she's probably got Sjogren's syndrome. What is it? It's one of the most common autoimmune diseases, but it's very subtle in the beginning and it's difficult to diagnose. The only autoimmune disease that's really more common is rheumatoid arthritis. There's a good 3 million people affected in the US, 90% of whom are women. The typical onset is age 40, but this much younger woman looked like she had it. And what's going on? The immune system is attacking secretory glands in the eyes, and in the mouth, and in the intestinal tract, which can lead to constipation. Now, the antibody test that everybody was using at the time when I saw her was typically negative in about 40% of cases. So you really do have to do a biopsy. Ophthalmologists are pretty good at doing this, and I've sent a few people to ophthalmologists to get a biopsy. It's just a small amount of tissue.